Yeah, it allows me to as well. But okay, so that's recording now, and make that a little bit smaller. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first of our Talk Grasslands presentations for winter 2023-2024. We have three very interesting presentations from diverse presenters and regions. And the first presentation is by Santiago Soliveres, Codina. That's today's presentation. The next one will then be on the 6th of February and the final one on the 12th of March. So Santiago is from the Codina lab in Alicante, and he's going to talk to us today about biodiversity functioning relationships in grasslands and elsewhere. So please, Santi, the floor is yours.
So thanks, Steve, for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to this nice seminar series. I hope I can introduce some interesting science that might foster new collaborations and new research in the EDGG group. And well, everybody in the audience knows about how important are Palearctic grasslands and semi-natural and natural grasslands elsewhere as a biodiversity hotspot, mainly as a plant biodiversity hotspot. I hope I can convince you about the importance of that diversity, of conserving that diversity for the functioning of ecosystems. So the research, as Stephen was introducing, is about the relationship in between these biodiversity changes and how those ecosystems process nutrients, biomass, how they interact with other trophic groups, and so on, and what can we learn, or what have we learned over the last years on this regard. So actually the biodiversity functioning research, which pretty much states that high levels of biodiversity are good to maintain high levels of processes that are of interest for human beings, like food production or fodder production for livestock in grasslands. They started, or they have fed upon mostly on grasslands experiments. And the main reason for that is actually grasslands are a great venue to produce experiments on the consequences of biodiversity change. First of all, because many grasslands species do germinate well and do grow well, and they are relatively fast dynamics. So you can start an experiment and in a couple of years have a very nice range of communities or diversities and have results, which is not the case in the semi-arid lands that I'm working right now, or in the forest that other people in the audience is working, that they are very slow dynamics and it takes a while to actually gather results. So what we have found, and I place here in the presentation, the two major, or the two best well-known experiments. One is in Cedar Creek in Minnesota in the US, and that was started by David Tillman like quite a while ago, actually almost 30 years. And the other one is one of the biggest biodiversity functioning experiment, which is placed in Germany, in Jena, in the city of Jena, and is also on a grassland experiment. All these experiments, and there are a few more, consist on manipulations because they are relatively easy to manipulate. You have a lot of plots like these little quadrats here. It might be bigger or smaller, where you can manipulate the number of species and see what happens in the ecosystem afterwards. So the main results of all these preliminary or these seminal studies were pointing to the same plot, and is that the species-rich grasslands are commonly more productive. We can see that in this graph here, as a classic experiment by David Tillman, where we have in the x-axis the number of plant species and how they grow more biomass the more species you have, until you have a saturated curve. And one of the mechanisms behind that is because they are actually more diverse grasslands are more efficient in using nutrients, which is the second graph here, where you can see the nitrate, one of the most limiting factors for plant growth, and how that quickly depletes when you have more species. And that's the reason, because They have different niches, they have different root depths, and they can access different sources of nutrients. So the more species you have, the more efficient they get into harvesting those nutrients and the more productive it gets. So that was one of the claims to favor biodiversity conservations, not only on grasslands, but elsewhere. And although it has failed and the other conservation claims, it announced that conserving biodiversity is not only important because of the sake of conservation, but also because it can affect very important processes where human well-being depends, like the production of the primary production, which is related to the food resources and so on. And also one of these classic experiments, and that's the last graph here, is that diverse grasslands, because different species respond in a different way to change in environmental conditions. If you have more diverse grassland, you will have more resistance to environmental change, in that particular case to drought. So it was this accidental drought, or this natural drought, that occurred during the experimental work, and they could see that the more species reach the grassland is, the more resistant, the less biomass loss it suffered. All right. And the reason this diversity relationship with functioning is studied in grasslands is not only because it's easier to study in this particular set of systems than in others, but also because they are super important, not only in terms of biodiversity conservation, which they are, and you know that very well, but also because they produce a range of ecosystem services that are extremely important and extremely basic for human well-being. And I'm showing here a figure of this very nice paper that I read recently from Bengston and co-workers in 2019. And you can see here the family of ecosystem services that any grasslands in the world might produce. In this particular example, it was from Northern Europe. They also investigated South African grasslands, natural grasslands. This one in Northern Europe is obviously semi-natural or managed. And in addition to fodder production, which is pretty much the main function or service that humans take from grasslands, and obviously biodiversity conservation, which is related to tourism and cultural services, we have very important services for crop production and also for pest control elsewhere. And these are pollination and biological control, but also grasslands do play an important role in carbon storage. And the more productive the grassland, the more carbon might store. And there are also a number of functions or services related to water quantity, regulation and quality, greenhouse gas emissions, and so on and so forth. And the reason I choose to show this graph is you can see that biodiversity, and in that particular case is plant richness, is at the core, is very centered on the ecosystem service supply of these grasslands. So again, it's not only because it's easier to manipulate, and it is not only because it was some of the first cases to show the importance or the consequences of losing biodiversity for ecosystem services, but also grasslands do produce a number of ecosystem services we depend on. So which are the mechanisms and which are the general patterns often observed in this biodiversity functioning relationship? That's starting to be a classic. It's from 2012, but it's already fairly well cited. And that's the sort of relationship you often found when you study biodiversity functioning relationships. So you have your measure of biological diversity, normally plant species richness, and you have your measure of ecosystem function. It started with plant biomass, but is broadening clearly the range of processes measured. And you get this kind of saturating curve, right? So at the beginning, you have monocultures or very low species diversity, and they produce less biomass or they function less well than rich environments. And they are also more variable. You can have monocultures or low species that function very well, and monocultures that function really poorly under this set of circumstances. But overall, you have an increasing functioning with diversity that it saturates up to some point, meaning that from this point onward, from the asymptote between diversity functioning relationship, you get some kind of redundancy, right? So from this, I'm not sure if you see my mouse, I hope so. From this point onwards, the more species you add to the ecosystem, the more redundant they get. So they don't add extra processes or extra function or extra levels of your interest service in that particular case. Okay, so saturating relationship seems to be commonwealth or widespread in this field, not only in grasslands but elsewhere. And also the main mechanisms behind the diversity functional relationship can be two. The first one is, as I was saying, species might complement each other because they have different rooting depths, different growth patterns, different phenologies, and therefore the more diversity you have, the more complementary effects you get. The more they complement each other, the more they have added value. And the second one is sort of called selection effect or lottery effect, or they have many names. But the philosophy behind that is if you have lots of species, it's easier to find one than produce a lot. If you are looking on biomass production, or it's easier to find one that fixes a lot of nitrogen into the soil through mutualistic relationships, or it's easier to find one that is able to prevent a given invasive species to arrive. Okay, so these are the selection effect as opposed to the complementary effects. Selection effects is one species is driving the whole thing, but the bigger the species pool in the community, the more likely to find this species. And complementary effects requires multiple species working in tandem to actually produce this function. So in this nice meta-analysis by Bradley Cardinali in Nature, they tried to separate the selection and complementarity effect. And although it has been argued afterwards, that's still, for me, one of the best meta-analyses published so far. And if you want to disentangle between selection and complementarity effect, a very easy way to do so is to compare your diversity performance against the average of the monocultures, like in this set of columns here, and the maximum performing monoculture, that is the best species monoculture for this particular function, all right? So if the diversity effect is bigger than the average of the monocultures, you can conclude that there is a positive effect. And that was the case here for aquatic and terrestrial environments in a bunch of studies, 34 for aquatic, 42 for terrestrial. However, if you compare the performance of the diversity effects with the biggest or the most productive monoculture, what you get is no significant difference. That means that these positive diversity effects we observe are mainly driven by a very productive set of species, and therefore they are driven by selection effect, okay? So that's very often the case when you only measure one process at a time. So most of the time, as I was saying, biomass production was the target because it's easier to measure and because it's related to the main important service that grasslands produce to human. However, every time we looked at multiple processes, and we saw in the previous slide that there are many processes of interest in grasslands, species become less redundant. The more processes you consider in your community, the more species you will require because the less redundant they have. And also there are chances, although this is less clear, I will show some research in this regard, that more complementarity is often found and less importance of selection effect when looking at multiple processes and times. As I was saying before, plant richness has been the main topic on this biodiversity functioning relationship, mainly because these are the primary producers, so these are the basis of the ecosystem, but also because they are easier to manipulate. A few years ago, I was collaborating in the Biodiversity Exploratories project. This is a huge German project that are measuring in 150 grasslands, differing in the land use intensity, in how intensively they are managed. And they were measuring the diversity not only of plant richness, but also of a wide range of organisms that do live in grasslands. And I took the liberty here to take two of the last covers of the Palearctic Grassland Journal, the EDGG Grassland Journal. And you can see that actually grasslands are way more than plants. There are insects, there are predator insects and insectivorous insects and herbivore insects that drive ecosystem processes both above and below ground. There are bird species, there are mutualistic relationships with mycorrhiza, there are parasitic relationships both below and above ground, and there are a bunch of organisms that drive ecosystem functions in grasslands beyond those of plant richness. So that's what we were testing here. And I want just to show there are 4 graphs. So each one is for one particular type of ecosystem services, provisioning services, meaning fodder production, biomass production, and the quality of this biomass to feed on livestock. And then we have regulating services, this pollination and pest control services I was mentioning before, cultural services, so aesthetic values and tourism values for the grasslands, and also the supporting services, which are all these other processes related to nutrient cycling and so on. We compare the purple continuous line. This is the multi-trophic diversity, taking into account changes in the diversity of these multiple trophic groups we measure in the biodiversity exploratories, and you compare that to the plant richness or plant diversity, you will see that the effect is often much more positive and much more significant for the regulating and cultural services. That means that taking into account many other groups is going to produce more services, and therefore the biodiversity changes across trophic groups is particularly important to consider. And another important one is this classical trade-off in between keeping or conserving biodiversity and having very productive grasslands, and there is often a trade-off. That's one of the reasons we are losing diversity in grasslands, actually, is because we over-fertilize them to get more production, and that comes at a cost, obviously, of losing diversity. And that's what we see here. And what we show is actually these trade-offs can be minimized if you take into account different organisms. Obviously, it's very difficult to measure all these organisms. The Biodiversity Exploratories is a heavily funded project, and it lasted for over 15 years now. And that is very difficult to replicate. So we did the effort to try to identify which of those other organisms were more important for ecosystem functioning. In other words, which will be the organisms we should survey together with plants to try to make sure that we understand exactly how biodiversity changes are affecting grassland functioning. So this is this graph here. And what we did is to organize the groups in the number of processes that they were involved in. And we found that primary producers, which these are the plants, were obviously very high in the ranking of important organisms, but also above ground herbivores, and by that I mean insects, were extremely important, even more than plants, in driving ecosystem functioning. And we will show, this is observational data, but we will show some experimental results later on that, and then microbial decomposers. So that's one of the first calls I wanted to do. When you go out in the field in these nice campaigns, try to measure things other than plants. And I know this is extremely difficult, but having this kind of diversity changes is going to provide a lot of information about the overall health of the ecosystem. And also, these kind of organisms do not respond in the same way to management that in plants. So therefore, we will have a more complete idea of the conservation status of these grasslands. Again, biodiversity is not only species richness, but if we do look at the species richness, we will have often this kind of abundance distributions where you have a very few species that cover most of the biomass or most of the number of individuals found, and a large tail of species that cover very few individuals. In other words, there is this large tail of very low abundant species or rare, locally rare species. And we wanted to know the role of these species for functioning. Obviously, one will think that the most abundant species are the ones driving mostly ecosystem functioning, and that was shown for biomass production, and this is called the mass ratio effect. So obviously, you have more abundant species, you will have those driving more a particular function. But we found rather the opposite. So both above and below ground, what you get is that the rare species are the ones driving most of the ecosystem functionings. I guess that's because they are less redundant, but I will also show some other mechanisms later on. And I was saying in the title that I will not only show results on grasslands, so we tried a similar approach in drylands, in a global dryland database that we have. It's called Biocom, and we measured diversity functioning relationships in 224 sites all across the globe in many drylands, like the one in the picture. And you can see again that if you compare the effect of the dominant species, this is the reddish, darker reddish colors, against the what we call the pure richness effect, like mostly or more commonly driven by rare species, you have the same pattern. So the amount of variance explained, sort of the importance of rare species is much larger than expected, and is much larger than the one for common species. Why is so? We found later on, using again the biodiversity exploratories data, that one of the main reasons is because rare species not only have more positive effects, but also they have less negative effects. So this is the red column. Again, we have common species here in this first column to the left, and rare species in this second column to the right. And you can see in blue the positive functional effects of those species, and in red the negative functional effects of those species. And you can see that although common species also show positive effects, they have much more of those trade-offs. And that makes sense, because the more abundant a species is, the more specialized it will get in, I don't know, for example, producing biomass or fixing nitrogen at a cost of resisting herbivore damage or pathogen damage and so on. Whereas rare species are less likely to show these functional trade-offs, and that will explain why overall they play a major role on ecosystem functioning. Do not get scared about that. I know it's complicated. I will go slowly on this particular case. So again, we didn't know that diverse grasslands are more resistant to drought, but it's super important for us to understand which particular community attribute is the one driving resistance to drought, because drought is going to become more frequent, more intense. It's actually becoming more frequent and more intense. And we need those grasslands to be as resistant as possible to this future harsh condition that we are expecting, right? So the biodiversity exploratories was only not great because of the range of organisms they measured, but also because of the number of years they continuously measured the same grasslands. So eventually it was a drought back in 2012, if I recall correctly. And obviously it was a decline on productivity, on plant biomass after this drought. And this is called resistance. The less the decline, the more resistant a community will be. But also communities do recover after a disturbance. So we did measure the biomass production after this drought stopped as a measure of recovery. And because we had 150 grasslands, we could measure how the different attributes were affecting this grassland's ability to resist drought and to recover after drought. We have here recovery 1 and recovery 2 is just 1 year after drought, 2 years after the drought. And we consider many drivers here. The first one I wanted to comment on is this Louis land use intensities. As I was saying, these 150 grasslands are managed differently. So they have different management intensities, different fertilization levels, different mowing frequencies, different grazing intensities, and all that is known to affect biodiversity or plant species richness in this particular case. And again, we do have a lot of common species, a few common species that are taking or soaking up most of the individuals, and a few rare species that are taking most of the diversity effects. So we wanted to tease them apart, and for that we use this structural equation model. So we have all this section here with the traits of the dominant species, or community weighting mean traits. And by traits, I mean things like specific leaf area, how thick or how nutritious the leaf is, how much it can grow, how big are the seeds, or how strong is the root pattern. So these are the sort of things that we are including here. And obviously they are related to each other through these trade-offs I was mentioning before. Another mechanisms by which species richness can sort of enhance this resistance and recovery is what is called portfolio effects and is related to what I was saying before. Not all the species will respond to the same particular conditions. So you have lots of species. You might find some species that grow under drought, some species that grow under cold environments, some species that grow under warm environments. So therefore, they sort of tandem each other up to manage to keep a stable biomass production. So that was more or less included here. The first variable here is the species abundance distribution, is how long this tail of rare species is, and the other one is functional redundancy, how much more different are the functional traits that the rare species are contributing, all right? And then we have here the abundance turnover, like this shifting in between the dominance of the different species, and the functional turnover, which is the same, but with functional traits, all right? So again, to simplify, we have the effect of the common species, and we have the effect of the species richness, and this is going to be mediated mainly through abundance and functional turnover. What we found is similar to what we found before with the trade-offs in between common and rare species. So here you have the main and most positive drivers of plant community attributes on resistance to drought, where this abundance and functional turnover, and these are the main species richness effects. However, if you look at the common species, you will have some positive effects, but also they trade off with some negative effects. And again, the same, those dominant species tend to be fairly similar across or throughout years. And the traits that promote functioning in one particular set of conditions might not be the ones that promote functioning the other way around, all right? And we found another pattern that has been commonly found in experiments, that is that the species richness is not necessarily well related to resistance, but they do help to recover after drought. So that's another call, again, for considering plant diversity, not only because of the current level of functions, but also because they will or they should ensure resistance of many grasslands to contrasting environmental conditions or harsher environmental conditions. I was mentioning land use intensity and how it affects plant diversity before, because obviously biodiversity changes are not the only changes occurring in our biotic communities or in our grasslands. We have a bunch of changes. Alicia Costa will talk about invasive species. That's another global change driver, but we also obviously have global warming. We are over-fertilizing our grasslands, we are using pesticides, and all that is going to affect biotic communities far beyond the mere loss of plant species richness. And obviously, grasslands are widely distributed across the globe, and they have different biotic conditions, different climates, different soil types, different land use stories, and all that is known to affect ecosystem functioning too. So far, I have been only talking about this relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, but we need to consider or place that into context to see how important are these biodiversity changes, comparing that to other major environmental issues that our grasslands are facing. So there is a beautiful meta-analysis by Hopper and co-workers in 2012 that was, for me, the most solid way to show. What they did here is to compare experimental studies, considering different global change drivers like multiple nutrient additions, but also warming, CO2 enrichment, acidification or drought experiments. And they compare the effect size of those different treatments, which are these different balls here, with what would be expected through the experiments that are changing plant biodiversity and seeing the effects. And you can see that even the larger of those multiple change drivers have comparable effects to those expected by losing a given number or a given proportion of species. So, for example, even extreme droughts are going to be very similar in the consequences they have for grasslands than losing 90% of the species. This is a very large species loss level, but it might happen if you manage your grasslands very poorly. That meaning that these changes in biotic communities can be as important as those major global change drivers, and we have seen that many, many times. So actually, these changes on plant species richness, these changes on multi-trophic species richness in grasslands are not only important from a biodiversity conservation perspective, but they are also extremely important to the supply of ecosystem services that grasslands produce for us. Obviously, all these changes or these biodiversity changes are not fully independent in between each other. So it has been known for a while that not only plant species richness, but also the diversity of the functional traits that they pose, the diversity of the pollutionary relationships they treasure, or even the dominant the traits of the dominant species, all that has been known and shown to affect ecosystem functioning. And all that has been known and shown to respond differently to environmental conditions. However, these changes are not fully independent, or at least we cannot tease apart what would be the consequences of these different biodiversity changes or these different facets of biodiversity, how they respond to the environment, how they react to the environment, and which are the consequences, unless we experimentally manipulate them. So I'm gonna briefly touch upon two very nice experiments led by Eric Allen and his group, and that's the website there. It's a beautiful website, as opposed to mine. And I really recommend you to check this out. And the two experiments are PanDIF and PhiloFan. PanDIF is a very large biodiversity experiment, similar to that of Cedar Creek and Jena. The main difference here is that they are actually manipulating the environment. So they are adding nitrogen, very large amounts of nitrogen, mimicking that of over-fertilizations or nitrogen deposition. And they are also excluding fungal pathogens through the application of fungicide. And the biotic community changes, they are taking that into account, this plant richness, that would be the classic one, but they are also independently manipulated functional composition. So they are within a given plant species richness level, they are experimentally manipulating how productive this community is or how not. And obviously, nitrogen and fungicide will have different environmental changes on C2N ratios in the soil or pH that could directly affect ecosystem functioning. PhiloFan instead is a greenhouse experiment. That's still an experiment. And in here, we manipulate it independently, or we build communities which on purpose were minimizing the correlation between functional diversity and phylogenetic diversity. And these are very well-known biodiversity facets to affect ecosystem functioning. And again, we wanted to compare them with strong environmental changes that are related to grassland management, which are the application of pesticides, in this particular case, insecticide and fungicide. We wanted to know the relative importance of all these changes and precisely how they interact, because again, we need to place biodiversity in context, and we don't expect these biodiversity functioning relationships to be stable or consistent across many environments. We need to know how grassland management is going to affect ecosystem functioning and which role is plant communities playing onto that. So let me show the first results on PanDIF. Well, actually, the first results were published a while ago. The first biodiversity functioning results of PanDIF, they were published like last week, actually, in Ecology Letters. And let me navigate through those results. When you compare independently the effect of plant richness and functional composition, as opposed to nitrogen and pesticide, you learn many things. The main thing here is actually plant species richness is not consistently affecting functioning, but actually it does so mainly for fast communities. So communities that grow fast seem to be less redundant, as I will show later, and therefore diversity is more important on those particular communities. And if you compare the effect size with these two major grassland management techniques, which is applying fertilizers or pesticides, you will see that the effect size that we observe is as big or even bigger than the one with these major environmental changes related to this Cooper meta-analysis I was showing before. The second thing we learn is actually functional composition and functional diversity are very important. They do increase ecosystem functioning or multifunctionality, which is just a metric averaging out many multiple processes at the same time. And you can see without nitrogen addition, this functional diversity is positive for ecosystem functioning. And the same happens when you don't have fungicide. However, if you add fertilizer, if you add fungicide, what you have is shifting this relationship. So management is not only affecting plant biodiversity, but it's also modulating or is also shifting how plant biodiversity affects functioning. On a separate note, for management application perspective, what we are doing actually when we fertilize or when we add pesticides to our grasslands are pretty much substituting natural processes that are performed for free. We are now paying to do these processes that are of interest for us, like plant productivity or forage production, and we are doing so less efficiently than the pure plant biodiversity will do. And as I was saying, if you compare this functional redundancy, that means how positive or how negative are the effects of each one of those plant species on different functions. You can see that, as happened with rare species before, fast species are less redundant than slow species in this particular study case. And therefore, that explains why species richness or biodiversity effects are stronger in this particular set of communities. In the second one, in the field of fun, as I was saying, we compare the effect of functional diversity and phylogenetic diversity. In that particular case, we directly ignored species richness. The species richness was kept constant into 4 species. And we compare this effect with the major use of pesticides, insecticide, and fungicide. And again, what we could see here, and I'm only showing results for 4 functions: biomass, an enzyme, soil enzyme released by plant roots and fungi related to phosphorus uptake in the soil, soil carbon accumulation, and an enzyme released by soil microbes to release or to break down organic matter into the soil. And you can see again that the effect sizes of biodiversity itself, and this is NPD, functional diversity, phylogenetic diversity, and RAW-Q, functional diversity, you can see that this effect size in general, they are as big and as those found for insecticide and fungicide, which means that these biotic changes have as strong consequences for environment or for ecosystem functioning than major management techniques often applied in grasslands. And again, as we observe in the other experiment, phylogenetic and functional diversity effects on functioning are not independent. That means that if you apply fungicide, if you apply insecticide, they tend to be more negative in general for many of the functions we studied. So again, if you manage intensively grasslands, what you are doing is substituting natural processes by human-made processes at an economic cost and with lower efficiency. So far I was showing only results of local experiments, right? We are working with local experiments. However, when I moved back to Alicante, to southeast Spain, this is the type of ecosystems or Mediterranean ecosystems I work with. And you can see that the different habitats are mixed across the landscape. Obviously, you have pure grasslands, pure forest, or pure whatever ecosystem you are working in. What you will have is all these different ecosystems growing together, one to the other, connected one to the other, and flowing nutrients and organisms from one to the other. So what is the relative effect of local diversity changes versus these landscape changes is what interested me the most once I arrived back in 2019 here. So I started a project on that, and many other people, many other groups have been working on that. And actually, these heterogeneous landscapes are not only a characteristic of Mediterranean landscapes. I took the liberty to take one photo from your website, and this is by Jürgen Dengler. I hope he's here. And you can see that in the grasslands that you normally sample, you normally focus on the grasslands like we all do in the ecosystem we work with, but you can see a bunch of different ecosystems types growing next to each other. And obviously, they're going to have an effect not only on the local functioning, but also on the processes occurring nearby. So again, what we wanted to do, or we developed a study to see first, how consistent are biodiversity ecosystem functioning relationships across these different land uses or habitat types. And second, what is the relative importance of this landscape structure versus local biodiversity changes. So that's work by Paula López-Osa and other colleagues. That's the PhD thesis of Paula. And what she did is to compare the effect of plant richness, that's the x-axis, we are back into plant richness to sort of recover the classic studies, and the effect of plant richness on ecosystem functioning. And in different columns, we have different types of ecosystems. So we have orchards or tree crops. We have shrublands, natural shrublands, pine forests, which were plantation, and oak and mixed forests, which are the native sort of top communities we can find. And you can see that the relationship between species richness and multifunctionality or ecosystem functioning do change a lot in between ecosystems. And the generality you can find here is actually the lower the functioning, the more important or the more positive are these biodiversity ecosystem functioning relationships. So that will explain why in grasslands biodiversity is often found to be so important, even more so than in other more productive ecosystems. However, you have already very productive ecosystems, species richness seems to be not as crucial or not as important. And that not only happens with very low productive ecosystems, but also in man or human managed ecosystems. Those ecosystems are the ones with the highest potential for biodiversity conservation to actually ensure ecosystem services levels. If you compare the relative importance of local plant richness in front of other habitat characteristics, and these are the blue sort of colors, and also with land use or habitat type, you see that habitat type, which is the dark green color, is by far the major driver of ecosystem functioning. So it doesn't matter so much, or it does matter less, the amount of species you have in this particular ecosystem, more than the type of ecosystem you are working with. And that is important because it helps to produce management implications at the landscape scale to see if you want to produce or you want to have multifunctional landscape, how you should manage, which kind of proportion of landscape you should have to actually maximize functioning at the landscape scale, which is at the scale that conservation and management takes place. And again, this is for Mediterranean ecosystems, but a very similar study was found, or result was found by Sirwell and co-workers in grassland restoration experiments. Again, they compare here local diversity, in this case functional diversity, with the landscape context, and by far landscape context was the biggest predictor. What consequences has that for the EDGG? When you look at local biodiversity patterns across different scales, if you do consider the type of grassland you are working with, how big the given grassland patch is, and which is the landscape surrounding this grassland, you might find out other more important drivers for plant biodiversity and for the consequences of plant biodiversity on ecosystem functioning. So I'm concluding now on time, so I will just draw a few conclusions from my research, and then I try to look for some applications for the EDGG in the talk I just gave. So first question or first concluding remark is, it's great to look at plant richness effect, but it's also good to look at insects and microbes too. As I was showing before, these are the three major players of grasslands ecosystem functioning. Second one is rare species are relevant for functioning, and they do provide insurance effect against drought. And one of the main mechanisms for that is because rare species show less redundancy and less negative effects than common species, but that also happens or seems to happen in some grasslands for fast-growing species. Not only plant richness, but functional and evolutionary or phylogenetic biodiversity facets are important. And not only they are important, but they do interact with taxonomic diversity. So with the measures you are having on field, you can calculate these biodiversity facets and see how they interact or whether or not they respond to the same thing. And perhaps the main one I wanted to highlight is that the environmental context associated with management and landscape, and that means not only the landscape context, but also the local management, whether or not people is fertilizing, the type of fertilizer and the amount, whether, whether or not they are excluding insects and pathogens through pesticides and so on, might be very informative, not only for plant species richness by itself, but also how these biotic communities are performing services, ecosystem services of interest for humans. And regarding applications to the EDGG, you have great, substantially larger amount of data and substantially larger extent than any other research group I know of regarding plant community composition across different environments and different contexts. So I would strongly recommend you to follow this very nice paper of Malte Johum and co-workers in 2020, using experimental data, because as I was saying, experimental data are great because they differentiate cause from correlation. But the problem is often they drive or they end up with unrealistic values like monocultures in grasslands, which are very low in frequency, if not impossible. So what he did is to reanalyze this experimental data using only those communities that could happen in real life. And for that, you have the best database I can know of. And again, when you go out in the field to measure this plant richness across different or nested spatial scales, it wouldn't cost too much to take local management information and landscape data that can be done through Google Earth and gather information about this context in which your grasslands is to provide more information. And however possible, and this is a more tricky bit, gather information on insect and microbial community should produce a very accurate measure about biotic communities regarding the ecosystem service supply in grasslands. And with that, I would like to conclude. Thanks very much for watching and for listening, and I'm happy to take any question. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Santiago. That was a fascinating presentation. Before we go on to questions, just in case anybody disappears, I'd like to remind you that information about the upcoming talks can be found in our website. It's up to date. And the next talk will be given by Alicia Acosta. I think Alicia is here now. And that will be on Tuesday, the 6th of February, on the topic of Mediterranean coastal dunes, threats and trends. And then the third and final talk this year will be on the 12th of March. And that will be given by Jens Christian Svenning on long-term perspective on European vegetation and implications for nature management. As always, the presentation today has been recorded and you'll be able to access it if you didn't catch everything. There was a lot of in-depth conceptual material there which you might want to look at in the future. You'll be able to find it then from our YouTube channel, and the easiest way to do that is through the link in our Talk Grasslands webpage. But now I'd like to pass it on, give the floor to the audience. Is there anybody who has any questions for Santiago about his presentation? Yes, Monica, please go ahead.
Hello. So thank you very much. I have very simple questions because I never heard about fast and slow species, for example. What do you mean by that? And,
thanks for the question, Monica. I wanted to touch upon many subjects and sometimes I forget to explain things. So fast and slow species is related to functional traits. So fast growing species and slow growing species, meaning those that have very fast growing rates that use resources very fast and accumulate a lot of biomass They often have very big leaves with lots of nitrogen in it, and these are related to, or as opposed to, functional traits more characterized in dry grasslands species, which are often less fast in growing. They accumulate biomass more slowly, and they have thicker leaves but smaller leaves with less nitrogen. So it is related. These are very well-known characteristics of the plants related of how well they use resources or how efficient they use resources.
So for me, it was surprising that you compare the effect of rare species to the effect of fast-growing species, that rare species maybe contribute more to functionality, and fast-growing species have the same effect as the rare species. Is it true? Is it okay? How understood?
That is the question I was most afraid of, Monica, because when I put this presentation together, I realized about this sort of thing. And it's funny, though, that the result is similar, but I think the mechanisms are hugely different. So for me, rare species are contributing most to functioning. And that was a broad experiment across 150 grasslands in Germany, whereas this fast-growing species effect, that was on a productive grassland back in Switzerland, a single experimental unit back in Switzerland. So I cannot really say that they are similar, although in this particular case, fast-growing species were showing less functional trade-offs. I think that's a very common thing for rare species to happen, and I think it will depend hugely on the environmental context whether or not fast-growing species do the same or not. But that's a very nice question. I haven't got a clear response as for now.
Yeah, this was very strange for me because I think that these fast-growing species are exactly those who are not rare, but the most
correct.
common.
I fully agree with that. Indeed, that's one of the things. When you do fertilize, you heavily manage, you intensively manage a grassland, what you get is a higher dominance of these fast-growing species. Obviously, you fertilize with nitrogen, you will get species that are very efficient at using this nitrogen and therefore grow faster. That's the reason we do manage the grasslands, to get more productive species.
Okay.
Remember, the effect we found is by independently manipulated species richness and functional composition. So that's a thing that you can do in an experiment that you won't be able to do in a grassland. So that might be actually a small artifact of our experimental setting. But yeah, it is true that is a not result, particularly when you put together rare species and fast-growing species and show the same pattern. It's hard to explain. But that's the reason I wanted to put that all together in the presentation, to in between all together might think about that, because I never ever put these results together and thought about that until the other day where I was preparing the presentation, to be honest.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm also quite unfamiliar with this like fast species concept. So I'm wondering, is it something like an Ellenberg indicator, that there's a table somewhere where we can check them, or is it just two categories, fast and slow, or?
No, Ellenberg values are similar to that, but I will say Ellenberg values are more related to the response of the different species to the environment, whereas these ones are related to the effect of these species on the environment. But it's not only fast versus slow. You have a continuous axis of variation there. And I think the best and clearest paper on that is by Sandra Diaz, the Argentinian researcher, in Nature in 2016, if I recall it correctly. It's called the Global Resource Economic Spectrum or something like that in plants.
Yeah.
And you often have a continuous of those values, and you can map where your species belong to these sort of fast-growing species, these slow-growing species, but in a continuous manner.
Sure. Okay, any other questions from the floor? One thing that I'd like to comment on before Monica's question, that I was very reassured by your finding that about the value of species diversity regarding function, because I think it was from Tillman's work in the 90s that very much gave the impression that species richness is of no benefit. There's a small number of species which fulfill most of the important functions, and if you get a few rare species there as well, it's going to have little difference to the whole thing. So are you turning this upside down now? Were there mistakes in the earlier research?
No, it wasn't mistakes. I think the main issue is what Dave Tillman did at the beginning and many others is to look one processes at a time. So they were mainly measuring biomass. And if you only measure biomass, rare species doesn't matter that much because the most productive, the fast-growing species will be driving that. But as soon as you consider the many processes that grasslands produce for humans that are super important, the more processes you include, the higher or the stronger the role of other species, mainly the rare species, because these are the vast majority.
Yep.
But still, you will find lots of researchers saying that rare species doesn't matter. I have encountered many critics in those papers talking about rare species importance. You often find many critics saying, actually, that doesn't matter. The common species are the one driving the whole.
Yeah. Another thing that made me wonder about this is you have this data where you have like 3 years of drought as a very extreme change in the conditions. I wonder if we should expect that when there is such a radical change, that the set of species that are providing the functions might change as a response of this disturbance. Though I guess we're not going to see that rare species will become over 3-year period abundant and some other ones disappear. It's always going to be the same ones that are abundant and generalist, I guess.
Yeah, I guess it depends on how rare it is. It might happen, and it has been observed that that's actually the reason to introduce a species abundant distribution. The subdominant species might become dominant.
Yeah.
And some rare species on occasions might become dominant under a given set of circumstances.
Yeah.
But it is true that what you will be expecting is just a shifting sort of dominance in the top hierarchy of species.
Yeah. Okay, Monica.
I have 2 more questions. One, you suggest that we should care about landscape. To what distance of our plot we should investigate the landscape? This is the first question. And then the second is whether these rules which you discovered are also valid for extremely species-rich grasslands, because I have seen the species richness 0 to 25, but if we have really extremely species-rich communities with, let's say, 60 or 70 species per 10 square meters, is it similar? Did you study also these cases?
Thanks, Monica. These are 2 great questions. Actually, you are on fire. Huh? The first one is regarding the size, right? So we never know for sure. So what we do is to try different we did concentrated circles. So we normally try 500 meters radius next to our plot, 1 kilometer and 2 kilometers, because it will depend on the process. In my experience, around 1 kilometer is the sort of landscape you should be aiming for.
1 kilometer radius?
Sorry?
1 kilometer radius?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but most of the people who has been investigating that, they actually use different radius concentrations and then see which one is the best predictor for the particular process of diversity that you are interested in. So that's as for the first question. I was saying, the most dominant ones are 500 meter radius, 1 kilometer, and 2 kilometers. For the second one, the GENA experiment, which is the one I was showing at the beginning in Germany, this experiment goes all the way up to 60 species per, I think it was 4 square meters or so. But you are totally right. Some of the times we don't reach enough diversity levels in the experiments, and we hardly reach the species densities that you might find in a Czech super rich grassland or in other super species rich grasslands. And that was the reason I was recommending you to try to find out from the experiments which community attributes are actually seen in the real grasslands, and try to reanalyze experimental data in this regard. But our experience, again, even with 60 species per 4 square meters, you won't have redundant functional effects if you consider a large number of processes. This is what has been found in the GENA experiment. If you want to know more about that, Monica, I think I cited in the presentation a paper by Wolfgang Weiser in Basic and Applied Ecology. It's actually a special issue. The whole paper, the whole special issue is a single paper on those results from the GENA experiment. And that's by far the largest gradient in species richness that has been analyzed experimentally in grasslands.
Oh, great. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, is there anyone else that would like to ask a question? Selene.
Thank you for your presentation. I have two questions. First of all, I want to understand, how did you choose the functional traits to understand the functional diversity? And also, I didn't understand the concept of functional trade-off. Can you explain it?
Yes. The first one is easy. As I was mentioning before, this Sandra Diaz paper actually was one Mark Vestoby in the 80s and the 90s, but this global trait economic spectrum, or the global leaf economic spectrum, is well known. So we choose the traits that they recommend. And actually, if you only can measure two traits, that would be plant height and specific leaf area. And that will provide you information about how fast the species grow and how efficient or how they use the nutrients. And that's very well established for plants. And if you could measure, or you could include dispersal limitation and early survival, then you will add a third axis, which is seed mass. With these three, you should be able to cover very well the range of variation within plant species in grasslands. And the second question was about functional trade-offs, right? So this is more tricky, but imagine, for example, that a plant that grows fast is showing very low resistance to drought, all right? So a functional trade-off will be, you can produce lots of biomass because you have fast-growing species, but once you have a drought, your grassland will decline very heavily, because precisely you concentrated too much on producing biomass and too little on resisting harsh environmental conditions. So that would be a functional trade-off. So you favor one service at a cost of another service or processes that might be of interest. Not sure if I explain myself. That's a bit more tricky to explain, but it might get complicated. But with this biomass production versus drought resistance, people often understand sort of it. Was it clear, Selene? Or?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question if anybody wants to ask. Usually we've had free discussion at the end of these talks, but today I have to dash and I want to make sure the recording is secure. So we're not going to have that today, but after next week's talk, then I anticipate that my schedule will be more relaxed and that we'll have time also to have some free discussion at the end of the session. So I'm going to switch the recording off now.